Imagine a landscape of sand, salt, and extreme heat in the western desert, a place where the horizon seems empty, the ground is unstable, there's hardly any fresh water, and silence dominates everything around. Now imagine opening a route to the Mediterranean and allowing the water to flow into the desert, driven by gravity, until it forms an artificial lake below sea level. This is the logic behind the Qattara Depression Project, one of the most ambitious macro-engineering ideas discussed in modern Egypt. The promise was enticing: to transform an arid basin into a kind of natural waterway, capable of generating large-scale clean energy from the difference in altitude between the Mediterranean and the bottom of the depression. Behind gravity as an ally, there were risks, ground subsidence, threats to aquifers, environmental impacts, and multi-billion-dollar costs. And an inevitable question: how far can engineering go before turning a solution into a problem? Stay with us for the next few minutes and understand why this megaproject promised to generate clean energy in the middle of the desert, and why it ended up becoming one of the great impossible ideas of modern engineering. The Qattara Depression is located in the northwest of Egypt, in the western desert, west of the Nile Delta, and relatively close to the Nile Sea Depression. It is a huge natural basin below sea level, surrounded by salt flats, salt marshes, sabkhas, dunes, unstable terrain, and sparsely populated areas. By the way, the scale is impressive. The depression covers about 18,000 square kilometers and reaches approximately 133 meters below sea level at its deepest point. That's like placing a 40-story building below the level of the Mediterranean Sea. And it's precisely this difference in altitude that has turned the Qattara into an obsession for engineers, geographers, and planners. On the map, the idea seemed tempting. If the depression is below sea level and the Mediterranean is relatively close, it would be enough to create an artificial connection between the two. The water would flow in by gravity, descend to the basin, and could power turbines along the way. It was a powerful vision, turning the desert's natural elevation change into energy. However, while the geography seemed to offer a rare opportunity, history would show that turning this idea into reality would be much more complicated than it seemed. The proposal to use the Qattara Depression to generate energy was not born on the internet, nor in science fiction videos. It has appeared in technical discussions since the 20th century, especially associated with the studies of the geographer and geologist John Ball, who investigated the region and published analyses on the possibility of harnessing energy from the depression. The logic was seductive. Instead of building a conventional dam, Egypt could use a natural depression as a reservoir, and the water from the Mediterranean would enter through a canal, tunnel, or conduit system, fall toward the lowered basin, and drive turbines along the way. Then, the extreme heat would cause some of that water to evaporate continuously. This evaporation would maintain the need for new water to enter, creating, in theory, a constant flow capable of generating electricity. For decades, the idea kept resurfacing in different contexts. Egypt had already demonstrated the ability to carry out major hydraulic and territorial projects, such as the Suez Canal and the Aswan Dam. But Qattara was different. It wasn't just about controlling the river or opening a navigation route. The proposal involved altering the entire landscape, creating an artificial saltwater lake, interfering with aquifers, and redesigning part of the western desert. And that's exactly where the real challenge begins. How can you build a project capable of connecting the Mediterranean to the interior of the desert without causing uncontrollable effects? Before getting into the technical details of the project, one thing needs to be made clear. Qattara is not a project under construction. There is no active construction site digging a canal between the Mediterranean and the depression. There isn't an approved project that's about to be implemented either. What exists is a historical proposal studied at different times throughout the 20th century and reevaluated in the 21st century. In May 2026, the Egyptian government dismissed the scenarios that involve flooding the Qattara Depression with water from the Mediterranean to generate energy. In other words, Qattara is a real project as a macro engineering idea, but not as a work in progress. Regardless, the imagined engineering for this region remains fascinating. The first step would be to create an artificial connection between the Mediterranean and the edge of the depression. Some proposals mentioned open canals cutting through the desert. Others imagined underground tunnels or combined systems capable of reducing exposure to shifting dunes, silting, and the extreme conditions on the surface. The length would depend on the chosen route. However, the proposals usually involve dozens of kilometers of connection. In some historical proposals, the entry point would be in a region near El Alamein, where the distance between the depression would allow for the possibility of a canal or tunnel heading inland. The seawater would enter by gravity. This is the heart of the project. Since Qattara is more than 100 meters below sea level, the water would naturally flow down and could generate energy as it passes through tunnels installed in the entry system. It would be an innovative hydroelectric plant. Instead of damming water from a high region and releasing it downward, the proposal would use the Mediterranean itself as the source and the desert depression as the destination. However, the system would require permanent control. If the depression were filled up to sea level, the height difference would disappear and power generation would lose strength. That's why the project would depend on a delicate balance: water inflow, intense evaporation, and keeping the artificial lake below the level of the Mediterranean. This is the point where the Qattara project stops being just a civil engineering work and becomes an artificial climate and hydraulic system. The extreme heat would make the water evaporate. The salt would be left behind. Over time, the lake would tend to become increasingly saline, approaching a hypersaline body, with risks of salt deposits, corrosion, and changes in the soil. From a construction standpoint, the challenge would be brutal. Excavating canals in the desert would require massive earth-moving, slope stabilization, erosion control, protection against dunes, and the construction of precision hydraulic structures. If the chosen solution involved tunnels, the project would enter another category of complexity: underground drilling, ventilation, lining, structural safety, maintenance access, and continuous operation in an arid and isolated environment. In addition, the region has an important military history. Because of World War II, any large-scale construction would need to consider mapping and possibly removing leftover explosive artifacts in sensitive areas, which would increase cost, timeline, and operational risk. Powerhouses, turbines, substations, transmission lines with gates, flow control systems, and emergency structures would be necessary. Simply opening a channel and waiting for water to flow wouldn't be enough. It would be necessary to operate a permanent infrastructure capable of controlling gigantic volumes of salt water in an unstable geological environment. The bottom of the depression is not simple either. There are salt flats, sabkhas, fragile sediments, swampy areas, and terrains that could react unpredictably to the arrival of millions or billions of cubic meters of water. By the way, similar projects help to understand the size of the problem. Large canals like the Suez and Panama required monumental excavations, hydraulic control, and decades of maintenance. In addition, large hydro plants require careful management of reservoirs, water flows, and environmental impacts. Qattara would mix all of this: canal, tunnel, hydroelectric plant, artificial lake, accumulated salt, and desert. That's why the main difficulty wasn't just imagining the project. It was proving that it would remain safe, viable, and environmentally acceptable after being built. When we put Qattara into numbers, it becomes easier to understand why this idea lasted almost a century. The depression covers about 18,100 square kilometers and reaches 133 meters below sea level, according to a British source. That's equivalent to approximately 2.5 million soccer fields. This area is larger than the territory of no less than 43 sovereign states. The drop at Qattara is also impressive. 133 meters is like placing a building of more than 40 stories entirely below the Mediterranean. It was this natural drop that fueled the idea of generating energy with the inflow of seawater. The connection with the Mediterranean would be another megaproject on its own. Some proposals mention canals or tunnels between 55 and 100 kilometers long, depending on the chosen route. In this sense, a technical study cited by Dr. Mehdi Hageb, a specialist in nuclear engineering, is revealing. Qattara would work with a flow of 700 cubic meters per second of seawater and a 15-meter diameter tunnel to reduce head losses. In other words, it was not a matter of geographical curiosity, but a proposal designed to generate clean energy on a large scale. In terms of cost, caution is mandatory. In 1980, the United Press International News Agency reported an estimate of between $2 billion and $8 billion for a canal or tunnel of about 55 miles, which is around 80 kilometers. Converting just as a current reference, without adjusting for inflation, $8 billion would be equivalent to about 40 billion Rs. With that amount, it would be possible to buy more than 530,000 economy cars worth 75,000 Rs each, or build 40 kilometers of underground subway in São Paulo. Using the simplified reference of 1 billion Rs per kilometer. In short, Qattara wouldn't just be a power plant. It would be a canal, tunnel, hydroelectric plant, artificial lake, salinity control, and permanent maintenance in the desert. An iconic project. The future of the Qattara project in the classic form of flooding the depression with water from the Mediterranean seems increasingly distant. In May 2026, a review by the Egyptian government ruled out scenarios that use the area as a seawater reservoir for power generation. The decision resulted from a combination of environmental risks, high costs, technical complexity, and lower attractiveness compared to more predictable alternatives. Among the main concerns were, unfortunately, saltwater intrusion into freshwater aquifers, soil salinization, and possible impacts on communities, agriculture, and activities in the desert. Risks to the Siwa oasis, wetlands, medicinal plants, migratory birds, rare mammals, and habitats adapted to the aridity of the western desert also weighed heavily. In addition, part of the region overlaps with oil and gas areas, which could require changes to pipelines and energy infrastructure. Thus, Qattara remains a fascinating idea of macroengineering, brilliant in concept, but too risky in execution. Even so, the Qattara Depression remains one of the most fascinating macroengineering ideas of the 21st century, uniting sea, desert, gravity, evaporation, and energy in a single proposal. But it also teaches a hard lesson. Not every project that is possible on paper should exist in the real world. Sometimes building is not about overcoming geography, it's about knowing when to stop, when to act, before the dream comes at a high price. Thanks for watching until the end. What do you think of these ideas about the Qattara Depression? Would it really be feasible or not? Leave your opinion in the comments. I'll be happy to read them all. I'll stop here, a big hug, and see you in the next video.